1. That's the number I want you to hold in your mind as we begin. To manage my Parkinson's disease, every year I spend 1 hour in neurological healthcare, 1 hour with a clinician, 1 hour in what we call the healthcare system. And I spend the other 8,765 hours, all of the rest of the hours of the year, managing my condition myself, in my own life, on my own terms. That's what this image shows. Each blue dot is an hour of self-care. The red dot is the clinical encounter. During the next 40 minutes or so, I will take you on a journey using this image as our map. First, we're going to zoom in on the red dot. We're going to look at shared decision-making as it's currently defined, researched, and practiced. Second, we're going to focus on the blue dots for a while. I will bring you with me into my 8,765 hours. The hours that shared decision-making currently often doesn't quite see. And finally, we're going to look at the whole image together and ask what changes when we do. My name is Sara Riggare, and I live in Stockholm, Sweden. I'm Isaac's mother and Per's wife. I'm a friend and a colleague, and I am a person who has been living with and learning from Parkinson's disease since I was 13 years old. I have a Master of Science in Chemical Engineering from the Royal Institute of Technology in Stockholm, and a PhD in Medical Science from Radboud University in Nijmegen, the Netherlands. I'm a researcher at Uppsala University in Sweden, where I split my time between the research group PATH, Participatory Health and Health Data, and the Center for Disability Research. Let me start in familiar territory, shared decision-making. At its core, SDM is a response to a very old problem. For most of medical history, decisions about patient care were made by clinicians, largely without patient input. The patient was a recipient of care, not a participant in it. Shared decision-making emerged as a principled rejection of that model, an insistence that patients have preferences, values, and knowledge that matter, and that clinical decisions should reflect them. On this slide, I have included some of my favorite contributions to the field as it has emerged over the last 4 decades or so. I especially like the concepts of minimally disruptive medicine and burden of treatment because they both demonstrate how what happens in the clinic influences the lives of patients. And as Don Berwick says, clinicians are guests in the lives of patients and their families. That phrase captured something important. Shared decision-making is relational. It requires both parties. And as Charles and colleagues also noted, no matter how much the patient wants to participate, if the clinician is not willing, then shared decision-making will not occur. The field has worked hard to address that asymmetry. It has produced decision aids, tools that help patients understand their options, weigh trade-offs, and clarify what matters to them. It has produced consultation frameworks, structured approaches to ensure that patient preferences are genuinely elicited. It has produced outcome measures, training programs, implementation guides, decades of serious, careful, important work. And in 2025, the 4th edition of the Oxford Textbook of Shared Decision-Making in Healthcare was published. It is, by any measure, the definitive work in this field, and a significant update since the previous edition. 66 chapters: primary care, palliative care, cardiology, pediatrics, oncology, emergency medicine, dermatology, orthopedic surgery, rheumatology, every major clinical domain, and many of the allied health professions too. And I co-authored the chapter on the patient perspective. Chapter 62, written together with Amy Price, Don Richards, Valerie Cates, and Glenn Hazelwood. All of the chapters have a box in them, a patient perspective box. Except our chapter, it has a box with a clinician perspective because our chapter is from the patient perspective. My co-authors and I proposed a framework for understanding the factors that shape how SDM unfolds in practice. we identified 4 levels of influence. The first is institutions, the healthcare systems and organizations within which care takes place. These are the largest and slowest moving element. They can create conditions that support SDM or conditions that make it structurally impossible, regardless of what any individual clinician or patient wants. The second is the situation, the specific clinical context in which a decision arises. Whether the situation is familiar or unfamiliar, routine or urgent, shapes what's possible in any given encounter. The third is the clinician, their attitudes, skills, and knowledge, and their willingness to engage as a genuine partner. Clinicians can be more or less progressive in how they approach patient involvement, and they operate within the constraints of the institutions around them. And the fourth is the patient, their levels of skills and knowledge about their own condition, their experience navigating healthcare, their capacity on any given day. In our model, this runs from lower levels, someone new to a diagnosis, unfamiliar with the system, to what we call a self-empowered patient, someone who has lived with a condition for years and developed a kind of expertise that is different in character from clinical expertise. Different, but not lesser than it. Let me show you what these 4 factors look like in combination. In the first scenario, a patient with high levels of skills and knowledge encountering a clinician who is conservative in how they approach patient involvement in an unfamiliar clinical situation within an institution that's generally resistant to shared decision making. Even though this patient may be both willing and able to participate, SDM is unlikely. The conditions around it won't allow it. In the second scenario, a patient with lower levels of skills and knowledge meeting a progressive clinician in a familiar situation within a supportive institution. Here, SDM is much more likely, even though the patient brings less to the table, because the other 3 factors create conditions for it. The framework shows that SDM is not simply a property of individual willingness. It is a product of the whole system. I want to pause on that because it connects directly to something I experienced personally. To a self-empowered patient, which I am, shared decision-making in healthcare can feel like an alien perspective. Because as I see it, shared decision-making is a healthcare setting thing. In my everyday life, I am the decision-maker. In our chapter, we wrote, the patient of the future is already here. We meant it, we believe it, and I want to come back to it later. In closing part 1, I want to return to something I said a few minutes ago. Remember this statement from Carl May, Victor Montori, and Francis Mayer? We need minimally disruptive medicine. I mentioned it to a friend, and he said, minimally disruptive medicine? That seems wrong. Shouldn't medicine be maximally supportive? Let me take you into the other 8,765 hours. I want to do this with specifics, because I think the abstract version, that patients manage their conditions between appointments, is something everyone in this room already knows and already accepts. What I want to show you is the texture of it. Let me start with an example that sits closely to shared decision making. I have been taking an extended release Parkinson's medication, prescribed to be taken once a day in the morning. After some time, I noticed that the effect was stronger in the morning, but wore off a bit later in the day. That made me think, what if I took lower doses, more frequently spread across the day? Could that maybe give me a more even effect throughout the day? To be able to try this, I needed a new prescription for the same medication in a lower strength. So I mentioned my idea at my next neurology appointment. My neurologist considered it and said, according to the information from the manufacturer, it really should be sufficient to take this medication only once a day. It does seem inconvenient for you to take it at multiple times instead. But I guess if you really want to, you can try. I left his office with a new prescription. I'll come back to tell you what happened. My next example is from January 2019. We had just come back from New York, where we had spent Christmas and New Year's. I love New York, but that trip had exhausted me in a way I hadn't experienced before. Not from sightseeing, from walking. Parkinson's can give you a wide range of motor and non-motor symptoms, and my most troublesome Parkinson's symptom is related to my walking. When I'm walking and something unexpected happens, for example, a car suddenly sounding the horn or someone starting to shout, my reaction will be much larger than anyone else's, and my feet will seem glued to the ground. This phenomenon is called freezing of gait, and it gets worse in stress and cold weather. It will make me unable to move for a few seconds, which is really inconvenient if you're in the middle of crossing a busy street. So this means that in New York, I spent enormous amount of mental energy in constant low-level vigilance of managing my gait on unfamiliar pavements, in crowds, simply worrying about whether my body would cooperate from one block to the next. So when I got home, I made a decision. Entirely on my own, with no clinical appointment, no referral, no prescription. I decided to try a rollator. This was not a simple decision. A stick I had accepted, but a rollator, a four-wheeled mobility aid, felt like a different category. It raised questions I hadn't wanted to ask. Am I really this disabled? Does this mean I will never walk without support again? I found a shop in Stockholm where I could rent one to try. I went alone by public transport. I tried a few models. Then I walked out onto the street for the first time with my new friend. The first block down Fleminggatan felt awkward and unsteady. It was raining. I almost got the bus instead. And then, a few blocks later, something shifted. I walked from Kungsholmen through the central station, past Sergels Torg, all the way to a shopping mall in the city center. Alone, smiling in the rain. Later I wrote to a friend, I don't think I had fully grasped the extent to which my gait problems had impacted my life for a long time. As I wrote it, that sentence stopped me. Because what I describe is not just a physical discovery, it's an epistemic one. I had been living with the limitation so gradually that I had normalized it, absorbed its cost into what I thought of as simply my life. It took a single afternoon of walking differently to make the invisible visible. I also wrote to her, there comes a time when you just owe it to yourself to be more kind to yourself, without giving up. No clinician was involved in that decision. No shared decision-making framework, no decision aid, no consultation. The observation was mine, accumulated across months, and brought into focus by a specific experience. The reasoning was mine. The experiment was mine. And the discovery that I could reclaim my walking confidence and that I had not even known it was gone was mine. That's the work that happens in the blue dots. My third example is also about medications. Every morning, my phone alarm rings at 7 a.m. Every morning, weekday or weekend, workday or holiday. Because at 7 a.m. I take my first dose of medication. I keep the pill container on my bedside table next to a bottle of water so I can take my medication without getting up. That way, if it's not a workday, I can go back to sleep after taking my pills, and by the time I rise, they will have started working, and moving will be a little less difficult. Let me tell you about one particular morning. The alarm rings. I'm half asleep. It's still dark. I tip the pills from the container into my left hand and count with my right. 1, 2, 3, 4. Wait, I count again. 4. It should be 5. One pill is missing. I now have to make a decision, not in the consultation room, not with a clinician present, alone in the dark, half asleep. I examine the pills with my fingers. I've done this so many times that I can recognize them by touch, by size, by shape, by the feel of a groove or a ridge. I establish which ones I have. Of my 3 small round morning pills, I find the thyroid medication, it has a distinctive groove across the middle. So the missing pill is either my vitamin B or my once a day Parkinson's medication. I think for a moment, would it matter if I take a double dose of either, just for today? I reasoned through it. I reached the conclusion that it probably wouldn't. I take the 4 pills I have, open my pill container again, and take the 2 small round ones that do not have the groove that my thyroid medication has. From tomorrow's dose, swallow them and go back to sleep. When I wake up an hour or so later, the missing pill is lying next to my pillow. It had been there the whole time. That was one decision before I got out of bed, before breakfast, before I was fully awake. It required me to draw on years of accumulated knowledge about my own medications, their shapes, their effects, the risk profiles at different doses. No clinician gave me the knowledge in a consultation room. I learned it by living it. You remember my first example and the prescription I left with? After the usual adjustment period, the effect was markedly better. More consistent, more reliable across the whole day. I went back and told my neurologist what I'd found. Later, I heard from other patients who also see him that he had started prescribing this same medication the same way to them, with several doses across the day instead of once in the morning. I want you to sit with that for a moment. My observation from my own daily experiences of my own body crossed from the blue dots into the red dot, and from there spread into the care of patients I have never met. That is patient knowledge actually working. That is what it looks like when the knowledge flows function. And yet, there was no formal mechanism for any of it. It happened because I pushed. It happened through the friction of one patient being persistent enough and one clinician being open enough. A different day, a different clinician, a different patient, and that knowledge simply disappears. When I walk into my neurology appointment, I've made somewhere around 10,000 decisions about my Parkinson's since we last met. Adjustment to timings, responses to symptoms, experiments run and refined, patterns learned. Almost none of that is visible when I arrive, and almost none of what my neurologist knows, the most recent evidence, the things he's seen in other patients, reaches me between appointments either. The knowledge flows are thin in both directions. The stories I've told you, the pills counted by touch in the dark, the rollator, the medication I split across the day and whose benefits spread to patients I have never met. These are not anecdotes. They are the products of rigorous, sustained, self-directed inquiry, accumulated across years, grounded in a specific version of a complex disease that no one else in the world has in exactly the way I do. I want to be clear about what I'm describing. This is not a complaint about my neurologist, who works hard within the system he has. And it's not a complaint about ISDM as a field, which has genuinely improved what happens in that room. It's an observation about the shape of the model. The consultation is a keyhole. Important, absolutely. Hard won, yes, but a keyhole. And the knowledge that accumulates on the other side of the door, the 10,000 decisions, the experiments, the patterns, the hard-earned expertise of someone who has been learning their own conditions for over 40 years, mostly stays there. Not because anyone intended it to, but because the system was never designed to receive it. That, I want to suggest, is not just an inconvenience. It's a structural problem. And understanding why it exists requires us to go a level deeper, which is what we'll do in part 3. Look at this image again. We've spent time in the red dot and time in the blue dots. Now I want to look at the whole thing and try to name what we're actually seeing. The thread that connects the red dot to the blue dots, that moves knowledge across the gap between clinical encounter and daily life, is the practice of systematic self-observation, of paying deliberate structured attention to what's actually happening in my own body, of tracking. When I track, I use a framework for personal science. Personal science is a term used by Gary Wolf and Martijn de Groot, grounded in over a decade of practice in the quantified self community. They define it as the practice of using empirical methods to explore personal questions. 4 activities forming a cycle: question, observe, reason, and explain. What makes it personal is not the technology, but the control. The individual decides what questions to ask, what to observe, and how to reason with what they find. The researcher's own life is the research domain. I collaborate with Gary and Martijn around self-tracking practices. I've been tracking my Parkinson's disease for more than 2 decades. And I want to share what I've learned from that. There is a common misconception about what self-trackers actually do. People assume we collect large amounts of data and share it. With researchers, with clinicians, with each other. That's not it. Think about it. Other people with Parkinson's are not interested in knowing that I take my medication at 7 a.m., 10 a.m., 1 p.m., 4 p.m., 7 p.m., and 10 p.m. They are, however, very interested in learning how I was able to come to the conclusion that those are the best medication times for me. We don't share data, we share methods. We share how we think about our personal questions, what our reasoning process looks like, how we move from an observation to a hypothesis to a conclusion. The methods are generalizable, the results are mine. And the most important method in personal science, the one that took me the longest to learn, is this. Track to answer your own questions, not your neurologist's questions, not the researcher's questions, not the pharmaceutical company's questions, your own. This sounds obvious. It is not. I've participated in many tracking projects over the years, funded by governments, by the European Union, by tech companies, by pharmaceutical companies, by research councils. And in not a single one of those projects was the patient perspective given first priority. Every application said the right things. Patients are our most important stakeholder. Patient-centered this, precision medicine that. And then the funding came through, the work began, and something shifted. At the end, the excuses arrived. We ran out of time to give personalized feedback to participants. The funding wasn't sufficient to share data back with patients. If you just join our next project, we'll do better. I'm not describing bad people. I'm describing a system that has not yet decided whose questions matter most. Here is the asymmetry at the heart of it. For my neurologist, my Parkinson's is probably top of mind during that 1 hour per year when I'm sitting in front of him. And I understand that. He has many patients, each of them bringing their own problems, issues, and questions. But for me, my Parkinson's is at the top of my mind every hour of every year, whether I want it to or not. That is not a complaint. It's a structural fact about life with a chronic condition. And it has consequences for what counts as knowledge and whose questions get answered. I don't think the gap between the red dot and the blue dots is primarily a communication problem, or a technology problem, or a problem of clinical goodwill. I think it's an epistemological problem, a problem about what counts as knowledge, and whose knowledge the system was built to receive. Let me explain what I mean. In ancient Greek philosophy, there are 3 distinct forms of knowledge. Aristotle called them episteme, techne, and phronesis. Episteme is theoretical scientific knowledge, universal, verifiable, context independent. Think clinical guidelines, randomized controlled trials, systematic reviews, biomedical evidence. This is the language of medicine. Healthcare systems are extraordinarily good at producing episteme, recognizing it and acting on it. Techne is craft knowledge, the practical skills of executing a task competently. This is where conventional self-care largely lives, learning to administer insulin, monitoring blood pressure, following a physiotherapy program. Techne is teachable and transferable, and healthcare transmits it reasonably well, usually through patient education, self-management courses, instructional material. And then there's phronesis, practical wisdom, the capacity to judge well in complex real-world situations. It cannot be fully codified. It cannot be handed over in a leaflet or captured in a guideline. It's developed through lived experience, through reflection, through iterative learning over time. It belongs to the person who has cultivated it. What I was describing in part 2, counting pills by touch in the dark, deciding to start using a rollator, and choosing to go from one large dose of a specific medication per day to several smaller, that is phronesis. It is the practical wisdom of someone who has spent decades in intimate daily relationship with a complex, fluctuating, deeply personal condition. And here's the problem. Healthcare is a sophisticated, well-resourced machine for generating and transmitting episteme and techne. And there are models and frameworks for understanding and building phronesis for clinicians. But there are no frameworks for recognizing patients' phronesis. Healthcare systems were not built for that. The epistemology of healthcare, its understanding of what counts as knowledge and how knowledge is validated, is entirely designed around the traditional scientific method and conventional clinical expertise. Patient wisdom of the kind that my examples in part 2 illustrate doesn't fit that template, so the system largely doesn't see it. Philosophers call what happens as a result epistemic injustice. This is the harm done when someone's knowledge is not recognized as knowledge at all, when they are wronged in their very capacity as knower. Patients with chronic conditions experience this constantly. We walk out of consultations having shared our preferences and our symptoms, but not our expertise. Not because clinicians are unkind, but because the system has no category for what we know. The blue dots, all 8,765 of them, contain knowledge that largely disappears the moment we step out of that room, because the room was never designed to receive it. Consider that story from part 2. The extended release medication I split across the day. My neurologist later applying that approach to other patients. That happened, but it happened by accident, by friction. The knowledge traveled through one relationship, in one conversation on one day. There is no system that made it happen. And there is no system capturing the thousands of similar observations that disappear every day from patients who didn't push hard enough, or whose clinician wasn't open that day, or who simply weren't there at the right moment. That is epistemic injustice at a systemic scale, and it is the direct consequence of a healthcare epistemology that was never designed to receive patients' phronesis. Now, I want to come back to a line we wrote in the Oxford textbook. The patient of the future is already here. We meant it as a statement of optimism that patients today are more informed, more engaged, more capable of genuine partnership in their care than the systems around them have caught up to recognize. But the question it implies is the one I want to put to this room. If the patient of the future is already here, is the SDM of the future here yet? I don't think it is, not quite. Not because the field hasn't worked hard, but because shared decision-making, even in its most sophisticated current forms, was built to receive episteme and techne. It was built to support patients in understanding evidence and articulating preferences. It wasn't built to receive patients' phronesis. And that is the next frontier. I think some of you are currently thinking, but Sara, you have to remember that not all patients are as active, engaged, and knowledgeable as you are. Not all patients can do all that you do, and not all patients want to. I hear this objection a lot, and it is a valid point. It's definitely true that not all patients are like me, and I think that's a good thing. We need diversity in all fields. But the thing is, 10, 15 years ago, I also wasn't like me. Knowledge is not a constant, the level of engagement is not permanent. You shouldn't have to get a PhD in personal science for Parkinson's to be able to live a good life as possible with Parkinson's. The goal is not to produce more patients like me. It is to understand what makes this kind of expertise possible, and to ask whether healthcare systems could actively support its development, rather than leaving each patient to arrive at it alone, by accident, through stubbornness. Which brings me to the Chronic Knowledge Research Project, funded by the Swedish Research Council and running from 2026 to 2029. Chronic knowledge is my attempt to change how patient knowledge is being perceived. The project's title captures what it's about. Chronic knowledge is the knowledge healthcare can't see. Not because it doesn't exist, it does, in abundance, accumulated across millions of hours of patient experience. But because the healthcare system was never designed to receive it. I work together with a team of chronic knowledge experts from around the world. And our first task is to develop a conceptual model of what we call meta-self-care. Meta-self-care is defined as the process by which a person living with a chronic or long-term condition, individually and together with others, develops the knowledge, skills, and understanding needed to live what they themselves consider a worthwhile life in the presence of illness and disability. The meta is deliberate. It describes not what you do to manage your condition on a given day. That's self-care, and frameworks for that exist. It describes the deeper, continuous process through which you develop, over time, the understanding that makes that management possible. The difference between following a plan someone else designed and developing genuine knowledge of your own condition, your own body, your own life, and what matters in it. Where self-management asks, what do I do to manage my condition? Meta-self-care asks, what do I need to know and understand and be able to do in order to live well with it? That is a different question. And it has a different kind of answer, one that is yours, specific to you, and that no clinical encounter can simply hand over. Meta-self-care is not new. People living with chronic conditions have been doing this for as long as they have had their conditions. We have written an article where we define and describe meta-self-care. It is currently available for open peer review in the Journal of Participatory Medicine if you're interested. The paper includes first-person accounts from co-authors living with Parkinson's disease, heart failure, systemic sclerosis, chronic migraine, bowel disease, HIV, lymphedema, rheumatoid arthritis, and bipolar. Across every one of those conditions, the process is recognizable. What is new is the name. Second, we will investigate empirically how widely this kind of expert-patient practice actually occurs, across conditions, across populations, across contexts. Because if phronesis is a widespread feature of patient life, that has significant implications for how healthcare systems need to adapt. And third, we set out to work together with patients and healthcare professionals, as genuine co-creators, on practical recommendations for how patient wisdom can be integrated into healthcare rather than lost at the consultation room door. We are convinced that the invisibility of patient knowledge is not inevitable, that it's a design problem. Design problems can be redesigned. Running alongside chronic knowledge and connecting directly to it is a book I co-authored this year with Gary Wolf, Martin de Groot, and others. It's called The Quantified Self Learning to Observe, where chronic knowledge is the research, investigating how patient knowledge develops and how healthcare systems can learn to receive it. The book is the practice, a working guide that puts the methods of personal science into anyone's hands making the case that empirical inquiry belongs to everyone, not just to scientists and clinicians. The two efforts are different in form, but they are asking the same question, and they are arriving at the same time. In closing, I want to tell you what I want from healthcare, and I'll say this plainly because I think it's important. I do not want more information. I have plenty of that. And I definitely don't want more time with my different doctors. I want to have as few red dots as possible in my year. What I want is for healthcare to develop the capacity to learn from me, not just to prescribe to me or to share information with me, or even to share decisions with me in the red dot, but to genuinely learn from what I know, from over 40 years of living with, studying, and refining my understanding of my own condition. That's a different kind of partnership. It requires healthcare to expand its epistemology, to develop new categories for what counts as knowledge, and where knowledge can come from. It requires SDM as a field to ask whether sharing decisions is enough, or whether we also need to share the knowledge that decisions are made from. So, here is the question I want to leave you with. Looking at the patient perspective with a wider lens, if shared decision making is to mean something in all of this, not just in the red dot, but in the blue dots too, what would need to change? In how we define a decision, in how we define sharing, in what we count as knowledge and who we count as a knowledge producer. The blue dots are full of knowledge. The question is whether shared decision making is ready to see it.